Hi, I'm Carys and
And I'm Gary Young.
Every week, Gary and I will be talking about those stories in the news that are overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough.
This is Over the Top and Under the Radar.
Gary, how are you doing and who are you wearing?
I'm doing fine. I'm wearing Harlem Underground, my favorite Harlem tops. If you look on my Instagram, you will rarely see me without them. I do have 3, just in case people think that there is a hygiene issue.
Okay, but most importantly, who paid for it?
Disappointingly, professors do not get a big wardrobe budget, and I don't have any major financial backers. So I'm afraid I had to buy these myself.
I mean, obviously, we're jesting because one of the big stories of the week that we're not going to get into in the over and unders is Keir Starmer and various members of the Labour Party are having their clothes paid for. Everyone's getting freebies, but not us. How do we feel about this?
First of all, the idea that, well, he just gave me this thing and he didn't want anything for it, that's just kind of crazy. But secondly, you can't have an agenda that is going to target benefit cheats and say, we're making tough choices and we're going to do the hard thing. And then be like, oh, yeah, no, I like those specs. Yeah, give me those. And so there is a sense of entitlement.
I think the defence just is indicative of, as you say, a bit of entitlement, but like a bit of the government just living on their own planet. It just feels like there's no sense of like, what is the right thing to do? How are we going to explain what we've done? And it all feels a bit self-justifying. So rather than saying, look, we declared them, we thought that was enough. Clearly it's not, so we'll change our policy. You get all these weird self-justifying, like, well, I have to be in an Arsenal box because I can't be in the stands because of security, which I'm pretty sure Rishi Sunak's been in the stands.
I was like, what are you, 8? The kind of, well, how else am I going to see Arsenal? It's like, well, maybe you don't get to see Arsenal. It's not your right to go and see Arsenal. And when you are lecturing other people on like how sick do you have to be to get disability, how many kids do you have to have before we can give you money, the idea of you kind of having these conversations with these rich people, it means that there's a group of people and people said, well, he didn't ask anything for it. Well, fine. But like at a certain point, if he wants to call Keir Starmer and ask for something, Keir Starmer will pick up the phone.
This is one of the times where actually the more journalists have dug, the more it's all started to just taste a little bit sour. So yeah, I'm not into it. Buy your own clothes, Keir.
On the subject of buying your own clothes, I have a story from my time at The Guardian. I kind of think this could be any organisation, but I was sent to Berlin with a dirty shirt on my back. So like, Gary, you got to go to Berlin. This thing is happening now. I think I was the only person on that floor that spoke German. Go, go, go. Like, I had my passport there. I went to the airport. They bought me a ticket that meant that I was in Germany for 3 days, even though the story only lasted a day. I needed to buy some pants. A man can only go so long. And so I bought some pants. When I came back, I claimed for my pants because I got pants at home. And they said, nah, you are going to have to keep those because they're yours. Then you can't claim it. You can't claim for things that you, which I was like, well, when I've eaten my lunch, that's also mine. Like, and I bought these because I was on a trip. And they were like, no, sorry, because they're yours. And I said, okay, I'll bring them in. And they can be pooled pants. And if anybody else is sent away to do a story, they can have those pants. I'll wash them. I'll do that for you. But beyond that, they're your pants. I'll bring them in. I don't want them. And they were like, don't be so ridiculous. And I was like, well, no, you're being ridiculous. I got paid for the pants in the end. I
Listener, he got the money for the pants. Yes. Okay, I think I love this because I think this story tells us 2 things. Number one, it's a real window into your psychology. And I'll let listeners do with that what they will. Maybe they can empathize. But I think actually the second point
tells you I changed my pants.
It tells you to change your pants and it's important to you and that you listen to the rules. And then you're like, okay, well, this is in the rules. And now I just have an image of a box of pants in the Guardian offices that says like communal. But I think the other point is most of us actually, we do work places where there are expensive systems and they're not this lax. Like that's the reality. It's not relatable. Most of us don't work places where random people can buy us clothes and glasses and let us stay in luxury apartments. I mean, write in if you have got a more lax expenses policy than the UK government. But yeah, it's all a bit of a gross nonsense. And I'm in a bad mood about it. But you've put me in a good mood with the pants story.
There you go. You can always trust my pants. We wanted to read out some of your lovely reviews this week. This one from Apple Podcasts from Soap Zone says, perfect inspiration that there are great thinkers thinking and a team supporting alternative routing of the media agendas. Hooray! I feel you really get it across the generations, highlighting the rotten silo systems across all walks of life that prevent everyone from reaching each other. Keep up the great work. Thanks very much, Soapstone.
Oh, great thinkers. That's such a nice compliment. I've got another one from J Great Zero. Love keeping abreast with what's going on in the UK all the way from Germany. That's exciting. You're listening from Germany.
Yeah, I think that's Jay Grady.
Jay Grady. Anyway. Oh, you're right. Yeah. Okay.
Then I have one TD0189 from Apple Podcasts from Australia. That is a long way away, although not a long way away from Australia, of course. I love this podcast. It keeps me up to date with current affairs in the UK, but with intelligent analysis. I'm always so excited to see when a new episode has dropped and I gain new insight from every conversation. More than happy to support this podcast via Patreon. Are you listening, people? Keep up the good work, Gary, Carys, and team. And there is a smiley face emoji in there. So thank you very much, TD0189. Please leave a review. If you want to send something more in-depth, you can email us at info@overunderpod.com.
And thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon. Want to give a big shout out to everyone who signed up to support us with a regular gift. We have 264 incredibly generous paying supporters on Patreon. Please join them and support us. Go to the Patreon website and search for the podcast. This week's new signups are Casey, Stephen, RC, Janet, Lisa, Claire, Gary, Chris, Alison, Celestine, Hannah, and Nadine. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate the support, and to everyone who's already giving.
Please help support the cause to reach our target of 300 supporters by the end of Black History Month, which is in Britain in October. Monthly packages start at just £3 a month. So if you want to keep the show running, find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon.
So my over the top for this week is polling in the American elections. We're 6 weeks out from a very important election, even for those of us who don't live in the United States. Lots of people want to talk about what is happening between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. I just think we're drowning in polls, Gary, and we're drowning in analysis of the polls, and I think it's too much. And I did a little bit of digging. So in 2000, there were 29 national public pollsters in America. So it's 29 organizations, and this is 2000. So by and large, they're using phones. By 2022, that number had more than doubled. So now we've got 69 nationally recognized polling companies polling in America. Shock horror, now most of them are polling online. It's not that polling has no value. Anyone who's worked with me knows I bloody love a poll and I bloody love a focus group. They can be very interesting. I like a bit of data. But I just think at this point, the sheer volume of polls means that it's kind of hard for us to see the wood for the trees. So I'll give you one example. We had from the New York Times, pretty reputable media outlet, and from NBC, another reputable media outlet, a national tie and a 5-point lead for Kamala Harris, like around the same time. Then we've got all the in-state polling where it's like, oh, but she's up by 5 points in Pennsylvania. And the snap polling after the debates, even though most experts would suggest that like a big event, like a debate, is probably a bit of a lag. So you're not going to see the impact of it for a couple of weeks. And I get why everyone's doing it. I'm just starting to think maybe it's like a little bit too much.
There are two things there, really. There's the role of polling, which I think can be really problematic, that quite often I know journalists use polls when they should be using reporting. When you might be just going out there and speaking to people, they just rely on these. And that is a real problem for our understanding of what's going on. What we end up talking about is who's up and who's down, and not why it matters and what's going to change. It's noteworthy that, and this isn't a point about Britain being better than America, just different. And America, in a way, being different to a lot of places, that in Britain, when there's an election, you have to wait for usually the Lord Mayor or something like that of the town comes out with some serious bling, and they announce the numbers. In America, it's the news agencies that call the election. So these polling companies have kind of considerable power. I mean, it's big business. And the more polling companies there are, it doesn't make it clearer. All it tells us is who's doing well or who's doing badly at a certain moment, among whom. It doesn't even really tell us why. Focus groups might, but polls don't.
I'm glad you said that about it not being reporting, because I think there's some kick that like journalists get and then we all vicariously get from like having lots of lovely graphs with red and blue bars going up and down, even though they're not moving a lot. And it kind of reminds me of, I don't know if like during COVID, everyone became an epidemiologist or an expert on like the different infection rates. And I think there's something pleasing and satisfying. And we can all feel like experts when we're like, oh, well, Carmela got about 2-point bump on the poll because of this and this. And, you know, we've really got to think about the number of white voters in Pennsylvania. And it becomes this like weird conversation that we all get to participate in. But then I thought, well, what's the reporting I wish that was happening? And I thought the Teamsters didn't endorse anyone. So the Teamsters is a big trade union in the US. And historically, they've tended at a national level to endorse the Democratic candidate. And this year, they didn't endorse anyone. I'm not an expert in trade unions in the US. And I would like to know more, and I would like to know less about the polling and more about what's going on in the Teamsters, because also a senior member of that union spoke at the Republican convention this year. So yeah, I guess what I want is more reporting and less number crunching.
Interestingly, the Teamsters did support Reagan in 1980. They do have previous. It's a weird one to sit this one out. Of all the ones that you could sit out, you know, their capacity to represent the interests of their members is severely diminished. So it's a dereliction of duty, I think. You know, I had a thing when I was in the States. The way that elections are generally reported is that you're sent to, say, Ohio to do values against class. So Ohio has a lot of religious people, it also has a lot of working class people. Which one is winning through? And you go to a town, let's say Akron, Ohio, and you report on values versus class. The whole town of Akron could be coming down with gonorrhea. It wouldn't matter because you're there to do values versus class. And you go there, and generally, you know, it's intriguing when it comes to reporting American elections that reporters very rarely meet anyone who can't vote. They very rarely meet anyone who's not going to vote. They meet someone who's for whatever proposition they've gone to talk about. They meet a values voter, they meet a class voter, and they meet someone who's in between. So they go for the story that they want, and then they get it, and then they bring it back.
And this sense that like this army of journalists and pollsters are just sort of being dispatched to do the same thing. Like, I mean, how many people went to Springfield after that first debate to tell everyone what we already knew, which is that there aren't Haitians going around demolishing cats and dogs? And yeah, it feels like there's an oversaturation of stories we don't need and not enough reporting. So I think we've got 6 weeks, Gary, till the big vote. I think I'd love to hear from listeners about what do you want to hear about the US election, but I'm also going to try and dig around and just find a bit of the reporting that we want, because I think the polls, not that there's no value to them, but there's a bit too much of it. So I want more reporting and less number crunching.
So my under the radar this week is a report in the Home Office on the origins of the Windrush scandal that has been suppressed. And the judge has recently said, no, you can't suppress this anymore. Now, the Windrush scandal, for those who don't know, was a shameful moment in recent history. This was 2017, 2018, although it stretches back a little bit further, where mostly older Caribbean people in Britain who had been here for years, who had children, grandchildren here, most of whom, not all, but most of whom had no criminal record, had worked and paid their taxes, had done all the things that model migrants were supposed to do, found themselves threatened with deportation. Some of them were deported. They basically had their citizenship removed. Some were pauperized. They were kicked out of social housing. They were denied national health care, some of it urgent care, including cancer treatment. And this was because the government had set up a hostile environment policy in response to the rise of the far right. These were the people who were caught in its snares. They had to provide 3 pieces of evidence for every year that they'd been in the UK. Many of them had been in the UK since they were 8 or 9. They'd come on their parents' passports. Now they're in their 60s or even older. Even though the information that proved that they had been in Britain all of this time was available, the government said, no, you have to prove it to us. And if you don't prove it to us, then we're going to kick you out. And they did actually kick some people out. Now, the report that's been suppressed, which was commissioned because it was found that significant numbers of Home Office employees, and it's the Home Office who was doing the reporting, were ignorant about British migration history and British colonial history. And the report, which was leaked to The Guardian in 2022, concluded that the origins of the deep-rooted racism in the Windrush scandal came from the fact that, this is a quote, every single piece of immigration or citizenship legislation was designed, at least in part, to reduce the number of people with black or brown skin who were permitted to live and work in the UK. It said also the British Empire depended on racist ideology in order to function, and explained how this ideology had driven immigration laws passed in the post-war period. This was written by a historian who was commissioned by the government.
So this is a government report in response to Windrush to be like, why, how did this happen?
How did this happen?
Cover up.
They didn't like the report, so then they have spent the last 3 years trying to repress it, this 52-page analysis. They've gone to great lengths to stop us from hearing about it. The judge, bless him, quoted Orwell, among others, in saying, look, you know, if you don't learn from your history, you're destined to repeat it. And it is just one more example, this absolute outrage, this crime committed against elderly black people in Britain. They are not fully compensated, most of them. There was an apology of sorts, but then the government just kind of stepped straight over and moved straight on. We're about to pretty much make some of those same mistakes again. We've had Keir Starmer in Italy talking to the fascist leader of Italy to try and learn about how they do their immigration, coming back saying that he learned a lot. In fact, historically, this country's learning nothing from its history. It's repeating the same mistakes, and the victims look the same as they always did.
So basically, this report was written years ago, and the Home Office had to be taken to court for it to release it.
Yeah, and it speaks to, 1948, the year of Windrush itself, the year that HMS Windrush, which was the totemic arrival of Caribbean migrants to Britain, and is generally seen as a kind of a Mayflower moment, but without all the genocide that comes with, white people coming and settling on your territory and murdering all the locals. 1948, the Colonial Office had a survey, and in that survey, it found that half of British people could not name a single colony. Among the places that they thought were colonies were Lincolnshire, which, for those of you who don't know, is a county in Britain.
It's not a colony. It's
not a colony. And the US, which hadn't been a colony for
colony. Yeah,
quite some time by that
Incorrect.
stage. And so it speaks to this determined ignorance in this country. It's not amnesia, this capacity to forget in real time.
I think it's a good under, not least because, the Windrush scandal, which presumably most people did follow, but if not, The Guardian did lots of excellent reporting on it. I'm sure other media outlets do, but The Guardian was sort of the trailblazer in pushing the story forward. I think it also shows that the state isn't this neutral actor, because if it were, and if the Windrush scandal were this fuck up that, oops, we didn't know, and now all these people that we actually invited to come to the country have been demonized and like put in weird statuses where they don't know where they're going to live, some of them have been deported, then surely you'd stop at nothing to find out how it happened and stop it from happening again. Whereas instead, someone commissioned a report and they were like, oh, I don't like that. It makes us look really bad. And it's like, yeah, bro, you already look pretty bad. The only thing that could make you look worse is if you don't try and fix it. I'm with the judge. If you don't reckon with your history or have an honest conversation about it, I would hope and I assume that more people can name a colony now. But outside of Black and brown communities, do people know what the Windrush was? Like, I grew up in a part of London that has Windrush Square. I grew up with people whose relatives came on the Windrush, the ship itself. But do most people in the UK understand what happened? And until they do, how can we have this honest conversation about immigration that everyone apparently wants, but we never managed to have?
Two things, I think. That, first of all, this attempt that the right always makes to decouple immigration and race, and to say, oh, let's talk about immigration isn't racist. And it's like, well, obviously not. It depends how you talk about it. If you talk about it in a racist way, then it's racist. And that if you enact it in a racist way, then it's racist. And that most of our immigration laws have been rooted not on the movement of people, but on the colour of people. They weren't designed to stop Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, and the Irish coming in. They were designed to stop my parents and your parents coming in. There is also this kind of, when I look back on 1948 and half of the bewildered country, like, you know, on the one hand,
Lincolnshire?
Yeah, I know. Thinking that Lincolnshire might be a colony. And then these people from Jamaica, mostly Jamaica, show up on Windrush and they think, well, where the hell did that come from? Most of them don't know where the colonies are. And so there is, or what the colonies are, or what they did there. Sivanandan, the late and great editor of Race and Class, who said, you know, we are here because you were there. But if you didn't know you were there, if you didn't know what you were doing when you were there, then it's very difficult to follow what on earth is going on. It's like me walking in halfway through one of my daughter's K-pop films. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? I don't get it. Britain is like constantly walking in the middle of a movie that it put on, but then walked out the bloody room.
People call it empire amnesia, this idea of just like, well, how did we? And I think we all have, I mean, maybe not us as like Black people, but I think there is a responsibility now for people like that report exists and we'll link to it in the newsletter, and like it's our duty to read it and understand it. And I think the thing that jumped out from what you said was also this idea of implicitly all of the immigration legislation that was passed, you know, in the 60s and presumably 70s was an attempt to minimize Black and brown migration. And the reason I think about it is one of my favorite bits of trivia about Australian history is for several decades, they had something called the White Australia policy.
I know, subtle,
and in true, right? I know, well, I kind of love it because Aussies, you know, it does what it says in the tin, White Australia.
It's like the Chinese Exclusion Act in America.
Yeah, it's like, why, you know, there's some pollster, if this was like a Republican or like a sort of Tory thing, some pollster would have been like, you know, the new Australia. But instead, it's like, white Australia. We only want white people. And that was basically the policy for about 30 years. And I think the problem with a lot of this stuff is it's a bit more coded, but it's still there.
I would argue that it's not amnesia. You don't forget that you have enslaved people for 300 years and subjected them to colonialism for another 100 or so, like you forget an umbrella or you forget. They haven't forgotten. What this suppression of this report does is show that they work very hard to make sure that people forget. So my over the top is Lebanon, Israel, the war there. Obviously, I don't think there's too much reporting of that, but I do think that the way that it's framed as a regional conflict, when in fact, I think it's a world conflict in which we are all implicated, or most of us are implicated, is not being fully understood. And there will be, I think, just in the same way that Israelis have memory, they remember October the 7th, they respond. Similarly, so do the Lebanese. so do the Palestinians. We should not imagine that there will not be a response to these attacks. And we should not imagine that those attacks will be limited to that region, but instead they will come after those countries, as well as Israel, those countries that are supporting Israel and sending them arms, and that includes us. This framing of it as scary but local is a mistake. We have to understand this as a global thing that we are involved in. And the effort that is taken to make it look like there's some crazy people over there who are doing these things, it's not going to work. Iran is involved because it funds Hezbollah. Well, guess what? As people who fund, as a state that funds and supports Israel, we and America are also involved.
The thing I've been struggling with in the reporting that I think also connects to, I guess, what the theme of the podcast is, this idea of people not knowing their history. There are real tropes around the Middle East and other parts of the world where the subtext of any reporting is like, they're wild over there, aren't they? Anything goes, bloody always blowing each other up. And it's like, there are two quite important pieces of information aside from what is currently going on. One is Hezbollah arguably only exists in response to an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Hezbollah, which we hear a lot about, was formed in the 1980s after Israel invaded southern Lebanon. And if you want more information, just Google the blue line, which is the line the United Nations said Israel should retreat behind after it encroached into Lebanese land. So it is important to understand what's happening now, but it's also important to understand the history, because otherwise you're like, oh, well, why do all these people hate each other? Something ethnic. And it's like, no, this is again about a state that intrudes onto other people's land, occupies it, and then we're meant to sort of begin the story at the point at which it gets attacked by insurgents. And I think you're right, we do have to think about what the long-term future of this stuff also is. But it's also just driving me a bit bananas at how ahistorical all of this stuff is. Why do people beef each other? They just kind of beef each other. And it's like, no, specific things happened. People are breaking international law. And like, I guess the final thing that I just think we should all be terrified about is that there's all of the international relations element of it. Politicians live in their national realities. And a lot of this aggression is about Benjamin Netanyahu wanting to stay in power. It's almost like he's like, once the killing stops, I might lose my job. So let's keep killing. And like, I don't mean to sort of turn it into a joke, but the more rockets and bombs that are launched, the less people talk about how corrupt he is or whether he should be leading Israel, given what happened on October the 7th. And that all feels very absent. And what we get is lots of images of people in the Middle East killing each other.
And once again, I would even go a bit further, which is that in the learned forgetfulness that portrays them all as being a bit mad and a bit wild, we forget that Britain had the mandate for Palestine, that this emerged from a colonial situation, and that the drive to create Israel was given considerable legitimacy by European anti-Semitism, by what happened in Germany and Austria and elsewhere, that particular genocide, that Holocaust, created the rationale. There was always a Zionist movement before then, but that created the rationale. Before 1939, the British Board of Deputies did not support the creation of Israel. That happened after 1939, and that's not a radical institution. European anti-Semitism made the case for Zionism. Not Arabs, not Muslims, good old-fashioned Christian European anti-Semitism.
Got a quick life hack for you. Obviously, we should all be informed about colonial history, but if you're just a bit unsure about something that's going on somewhere and you want to know if colonialism was involved, go onto Google Maps, zoom in on the countries and see if the borders are straight lines. So it's a clear sign that at some point a chap sat down with another chap, probably like a British chap and a French chap, with a ruler and carved up the country.
Yeah, just a little quote there from Churchill, who did once boast, "I created Transjordan with the stroke of a pen one Sunday afternoon in Cairo." Yeah, we're still living with the consequences of that. Thank you, Winston, for that great piece of topography.
If I say Sheehan, what do you think?
Martin Sheen.
Okay. Julian Dunkerton?
Yeah, no, you got me. That's just
Okay,
the
so
made-up
we're
name.
leaving the world of colonial borders for now, and we're going to the world of fashion. So my under the radar is there's a show on the BBC called Wake Up to Money, and it's like a business show. And they had the chief exec of a clothing brand called Superdry, Julian Dunkerton, on the show this week. And he came out swinging, shots fired, spicy chat about a giant fast fashion brand called Shein. So Shein didn't exist a few years ago and is now one of the most profitable fashion brands in the world. Its kind of target audience is generally younger women and people who use TikTok. It's now definitely bigger than H&M, probably still not as big as Zara, but we're talking a company that went from $10 billion in revenue in 2020 to $100 billion in revenue by 2022. And the point that Julian Dunkerton made that I agree with is that part of the reason Shein makes so much money is because it's dodging taxes. And to be clear, Shein are not breaking the law. So to be really specific, you're on TikTok, Gary, as you do. You see one of your favorite influencers doing like a haul. So she's got a whole box of clothes that she got from Shein. And one of them's like a dress that looks like Kim Kardashian's. And you're watching it, Gary, and you're getting a dopamine hit and you're like, I want it. And so you place an order with Shein.
You know me so well.
So the average price of an order from Shein is £7.90. So that package is worth less than £135 unless you really go wild, which means it's not subject to any import duty or VAT. But I think it's a really interesting one because we've heard a lot this week at Labour Party conference about benefits cheats and ongoing stuff about winter fuel allowance. But if this government were really serious about addressing the black hole, I'm not sure I fully agree with that idea, but this gap in the public finances, surely it should be taxing companies like Shein. There's also a huge environmental consequence in terms of waste clothes. Because if you're buying these £7.90 sequin skirts, Gary, and wearing them for a couple of weeks, eventually you get sick of it and you toss it out. Ghana, the country that I'm from, my father is from, half my family are from, has a huge problem with waste clothes and waste plastic clothes. Not only is this company harming the environment, mistreating its workers, it's also perpetuating something that people call waste colonialism, which is like all of our waste ending up in countries that we colonized. We're talking 15 million garments arriving every week in Ghana. I guess there's a connection to the Keir Starmer thing, right? Those clothes aren't free. And these clothes from companies like Shein, also Zara, also H&M brands, they're cheap, but they're not free. And right now, the people who are paying the price are the poor workers in the factories, the people of countries like Ghana, and the planet, who unfortunately doesn't have a credit card.
I didn't know any of that.
So think twice before you buy a sequin skirt, Gary.
Yeah, well, I always think at least twice.
I want to work out how we tax these companies, how we make them pay for the price that we are all paying indirectly or directly, and that our children will pay. And for me, that feels like the sort of moral imperative and the tough choices that we want our leaders to be making.
Yeah, I mean, that would demand, I guess, a government with some spine and some perspective that can look beyond the immediate. I'm not sure that we have that. And that can also have a kind of global understanding of this is where internationalism also comes in. There is a connection between the people who make the clothes and the people who wear them. Somehow you get a Nike swoosh or whatever, and that connection is kind of in some way severed. That if we lived in a moment of international solidarity, the people who are working 14 hours a day with 1 day off a month in Guangzhou province would be part of our consciousness. But as it is, we go to the store, we get the things that we like. Unless it's some super egregious company, we walk away without really thinking about it. And we learn not to know.
I agree with you. I feel I care about and feel solidarity for and kinship with the people making the clothes, the people dealing with the clothes waste. They matter to me. Their lives matter to me. Having a clean planet and clean water, I think, matters to all of us. But even if I didn't, and this is where if any Labour ministers, government ministers are listening, I would really urge you actually don't have to care about how Shein treats its workers to tax the company. Shein want to list themselves Jeremy Hunt was courting Shein. He was like, come and list on the London Stock Exchange. And like, we need a different attitude. They are destroying the environment, mistreating their workers, and just like making a small group of people super rich. And I don't think you have to care about workers in China to want to tax this company, to want to disincentivize this company. It is hard for us as individuals. We can make good consumption decisions. We can try and buy ethical clothes, but ultimately the rules of the game and the way the system is structured, like that comes down to government. And so, I hope people listening are not tempted to go and get a haul from Shein, but ultimately the way that we change this stuff is with laws. I don't know if that was a bit downer, a bit of a downer episode, Gary. Have you got any nice thoughts, upbeat thoughts?
Nice thoughts. That is
anything hopeful?
That is so hard. Nice thoughts. I mean, I think the idea of me in a sequin skirt is quite a nice thought, although maybe some people are now throwing up in their mouth a little bit. But
I'm still thinking about the pants, Gary, the box of pants in The Guardian.
The box of pants.
Gary's pants, now communal.
They're not my pants. They're pooled pants. They are corporate pants is what they are. I want to thank you for listening to Over the Top and Under the Radar. Remember to like, subscribe, leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.
We have a newsletter and you can sign up to receive it at overunderpod.com.
If you want to support the show, find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon.
And you can connect with us on social media. We are on X, we're on Instagram, we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, we're on all the socials. And our handle is always the same, at over_under_pod_.